All right, we're going to do chapter 64. Major Andre, guided by Mr. Smith, moved away from King's Ferry. Almost immediately they made a turn and came upon a clearing. Looking up a small hill, Andre saw what he assumed was Fort Lafayette. A soldier was standing on guard over the gate. As Mr. Smith approached, he lifted a hand. "Mr. Joshua Smith," he called out. "Compliments to Colonel Livingston." He turned in his saddle, then shouted at the guard, "General Arnold's good friend, Mr. Anderson." In a moment the gate swung open. When the two horses trotted into the fort, the gate closed behind them. From the small building in the center of the parade ground, Colonel Livingston stepped out. "Mr. Smith," he called, "good evening to you, sir." "And to you, sir," said Smith. "General Arnold's friend, Mr. Anderson." "Sir," said Livingston, greeting Andre with a nod. To Smith he said, "I was about to sit down for dinner. May I interest you, gentlemen?" "I'm afraid we must get on to Peekskill," said Smith. "Just paying my compliments before moving on." "Will you be seeing General Arnold soon?" Livingston asked Smith. "In a day or two, I should think." "Would you deliver a letter to him? We had some small action this morning. He should know about it." "Most willing to oblige," said Smith. "Was the action serious?" "We drove away a British ship," called Livingston as he walked into his cabin. "Nothing too important." Within moments he came back with the letter, which he handed up to Smith. "Much obliged, sir." "My pleasure. Good evening." Andre nodded. With Smith still in the lead, the two men left the fort and proceeded north. As they trotted along, Mr. Smith said, "The road isn't simple. After 4 miles north, we'll turn east, and only then south. Once you get to Pines Bridge, you'll be fine." As the twilight thickened, they began to canter, but just before they reached Peekskill, Smith turned east along a winding, hilly way. It was after going another 2 miles that they observed a group of men blocking the road. By the light of the lanterns these men carried, it was easy to see that they were armed. Now we're going back to Sophia. At the same moment, in Tarry Town, Mr. Paulding said, "Very well, Miss Calderwood. If your man does come this way, I will try and stop him, but we may not be able to. As you have suggested, there are any number of ways such a man could pass south. Where did you last see him?" "I'm guessing he was on the western side of Hudson's, north of Teller's Point." "What makes you think he'd come back to the shore?" "One of the American soldiers from Fort Lafayette told me that the closest British lines were at a place called White Plains. To reach it, he would most likely come this way." Mr. Paulding seemed doubtful. "How much," he said, "of this plot did you tell Colonel Livingston?" Not only did I feel close to tears, I found it hard to breathe. "Mr. Paulding," I confessed, "I was sure he wouldn't believe me, so I told him just a small amount. His commander is Arnold. What if Livingston told him what I said?" In the end, the colonel insisted upon finding his own reasons to drive the ship away. I had no doubt Mr. Paulding was finding my story too fantastical, for he became very silent. At length he said, "But you are quite certain that the man would come this way?" "No," I cried, "I am not certain. I was merely told the Jersey side has many of our soldiers, the same for Connecticut, that it would be hard for Major Andre to get through these places, that this was his most likely route." "True," said Paulding, "and if he does come this way, and you agree, don't you think, we don't know if he will, most likely he'll aim for Dobbs Ferry. It's neutral ground. Not too far beyond is White Plains, as you say, the nearest British lines. Get there and he's free. Now, if he does go from where you think he was, he'll need to cross over at King's Ferry, then travel south by Pines Bridge. Mind, after that bridge, there are 2 roads coming south. One goes through North Castle, where there is an American army post. That's where my Colonel Jameson is in command with a squadron of dragoons. If your Andre learns about that, and let's hope he does, more than likely he will avoid it. As for the other road, it does lead here. So if you are right, he repeated, there is a chance he will come this way." How I hated the word "if." "Mr. Paulding," I pleaded, "I know you only, at best, half believe me. Well, I know what I say is happening. I beg you, not for my sake, but for William's, for all those murdered prisoners, will you try to stop the Major?" "I'll be honest with you, Miss Calderwood. Your story about General Arnold is beyond belief." He scratched an ear. "I don't like to believe you. I don't wish to. But seeing it's you, and in William's honor, I'm willing to try what you ask. That said, I don't see the point of sharing what you claim. You're right. Not many will find your story convincing. They'll ask for proof. You can't give any, can you? I shook my head. Never mind. I have friends who will follow me. We'll post ourselves on the road and see what happens, but it can't be till the morning. Mr. Paulding, it's the best I can do. We are back to Andre and Mr. Smith. Seeing the armed men, Mr. Smith reined in his horse. May I suggest, Mr. Smith said to Andre in a low voice, you have your pass from General Arnold ready? Friends, shouted Mr. Smith, and they moved forward. One of the armed men stepped forward. Gentlemen, he announced, Captain Ebenezer Boyd at your service, 3rd Westchester Militia. What business brings you here? On behalf of General Arnold, said Smith, gesturing to Andre. Mr. Anderson, a friend of the General, I'm guiding him south. Without waiting for a request or speaking, Andre leaned down and handed the militiaman Arnold's Pass. While one of the soldiers held up a lantern, Captain Boyd read it. Once, twice, he gazed up at Andre as if to connect him with what was written. Very good, sir, said Boyd, making something of a salute, then handing the letter back to Andre. You may pass, but be advised, gentlemen, there are plenty of the lower party about. I suggest you put up for the night, so we're near. There's Tucker's place just along. Tell him I suggested he take you in. Thank you, sir, said Smith. Andre touched his horse's flanks with his heels. He and Smith passed on. He was right, said Smith after they had gone a while. It's too dark to go on with safety. We'll need to find a place to sleep. They passed a house with a candlelight in a window. We better stop here, said Smith. And we're back to John Paulding and Sophia. John Paulding stood up. We'll need to find you a place to sleep, he said, and, if I may suggest it, perhaps some better clothing. I felt a need to say, May I ask about your coat? My Hessian coat, he laughed. That time I saw you in New York, and after I saw my intended, I was picked up by the night watch and thrown into the sugar house. Remember how you told me William said it took strength to escape? I decided to make a try while I still had some. Once out, I relieved a soldier of his coat. German coats are very fine, he grinned, the spoils of war. I followed him out of the tavern. Once outside, he paused as if deciding where to go. This way, he announced. There were houses with lamps that allow us to make our way along a street that looped down toward the river. As we walked along, I could see something of Tarry Town with its fair number of houses. Mr. Paulding approached one of them. I stayed close. While he knocked on the door, an elderly woman holding a candlestick looked out. Mrs. Abbott, said Paulding in a greeting. John Paulding. Ah, Mr. Paulding, said the woman. Good evening. But upon seeing me, her face squeezed as if she just tasted raw lemon. A favor, Mrs. Abbott, said Mr. Paulding. This is Miss Sophia Calderwood. Her family are close friends of mine. She needed to flee the city and came to me for help. A bed to sleep tonight is humbly requested. Would you be so kind as to accommodate her? Mrs. Abbott considered me with more sympathetic eyes. She does look weary. Walked all the way, said Paulding. Goodness, said the woman, her face softening further. Come in, child. Mrs. Abbott, my many thanks. Miss Calderwood, I'll come for you early. I turned to thank Mr. Paulding, but he was already gone. Mrs. Abbott proved kind, first giving me a bucket and cloth to wash myself. Then she insisted I change out of my now ragged and filthy clothing. What she gave me was hardly fashionable, but no dress could ever be more warmly received. Moreover, she was civil enough to ask no questions. When she guided me to a private bed, I fairly fell into it. Even so, I lay there wide awake with the realization that the next day would bring success or horrible failure. We're back at Mr. Smith and Andre. Mr. Smith approached the house. In such light as there was, Andre could see it was a run-down structure. Smith knocked upon the door. It took some time and a few more knocks before the door opened. An old man holding up a glowing lantern peeked out. Yes? Mr. Tucker? Joshua Smith at your service, sir. On business for General Arnold. My companion, Mr. Anderson? I'm afraid night has overtaken us. Captain Boyd, just down the road, suggested you might be willing to put up a couple of weary travelers. The man examined Smith, then Andre. We have papers from the General to prove our peaceful mission, said Smith. General Arnold? All right, then, said the man. Mind, I've but one spare room and bed. Much obliged, said Smith. Andre and Smith, both wrapped in their coats, shared the bed. Andre didn't even bother to take off his boots. How much further will I need to go? He asked. You'll be in the city tomorrow, said Smith, with ease. As Andre tried to sleep, all he could think of was that in 24 hours he would be safe and triumphant.